Where's he will have, let me just pull up something really quick here. Okay, we are very pleased to have Dr. Lian, who is the David C. Steinmetz Distinguished Professor of World Christianity at Duke University. He is the author of The Conversion of Missionaries, Liberalism in American Protestant Missions in China, 1907 to 1932, and also Redeemed by Fire, The Rise of Popular Christianity in Modern China, and Blood Letters, The Untold Story of Zhao, a Martyr in Mao's China. Today's lecture is entitled Public Christianity in Contemporary China, the Sino-Christian Theology of He Guanghu of Beijing University. So with that, I turn it over to UC and go ahead and start your lecture.
Well, thank you, Tom. Thank you for inviting me. And let me see if I know how to do this. All right. Okay. It's really nice to have this opportunity to share with you what is actually a working paper that I have. And as with most of this kind of talks, the time after my presentation, when we get to have some good discussion, that's the time that I look forward to very much. And I'll be very interested in your comments and suggestions since I'm working on this. Now, I am going to focus today's talk on He Guanghu. But the reason for doing that is that I see him as an important part of a very new phenomenon in Christianity in contemporary China. And that is for much of the communist era after 1949, I would argue that Chinese Christianity has very much been a private faith. It's alive and well, vibrant at the grassroots level, but it was a privatized kind of faith with other worldly concerns and absorptions and private spirituality, and with almost no presence in the public sphere. In other words, it's part of the little tradition, but had nothing to do with the great tradition in modern and contemporary China. This is not to say that numerically speaking, that little tradition was unimportant. As you know, Chinese Christianity counted about 3 million Catholics and almost 1 million Protestants at the time of the Chinese communist takeover. And then by contemporary time, in our time, the total number of Christians, Protestant and Catholics, are numbered around, nobody knows the exact number. So somewhere between 60 and 70 million people, perhaps. And but most of that phenomenon has been a phenomenon of private Christianity. It has no presence in the public sphere and no contribution to the great tradition until beginning in the 1980s. Now, in the 1950s, in the early days of the communist rule, Christianity quickly became an underground Christianity. It was driven underground. There was, of course, the Three Self Church. And the Three Self Church occasionally was brought into the public sphere by the dictate of the state. And as you know, we also became the public face of Chinese Christianity. So at times it seemed that Chinese Protestantism particularly did have a public face, but that was not a real public presence. It did not really have a public voice because there was no independent voice. In the same way that if someone go to Tiananmen Square and shout down with American imperialism, You'll be fine doing that, and it is a public space, but it's not a public voice of independent public voice. So that continued through the Mao years, that reality of the absence of Chinese Christianity from the public sphere, that remained until after the death of Mao, and beginning in the 1980s, and then gathering steam, and ever since then, has emerged a really important, fascinating phenomenon of Christianity as part of this cultural mainstream, a public sphere. And Dr. Harvey just reminded me that, let me see, 11 years ago, there was this Oxford, there's a group of Chinese intellectuals from the different schools, the Neo-Confucians, the liberals, the New Left, and the Christians gathered where you are now in Oxford, at Oxford University, and out of which came a Oxford consensus of 2013. They were hoping that this will continue, but of course that did not. That was the very last of those meetings. And He Guanghu was part of that. He was the main Christian voice represented at the Oxford consensus. So it's a new phenomenon, and by our time, it has become much broader than a matter of, Christian public intellectuals, academics, theologians. It has now come to include Christian involvement in social work, in earthquake, disaster relief, in a number of things, pro-democracy movement, defense of civil rights and human rights, and then more recently, there was this case, very prominent case of a citizen journalist, Zhang, who was a Christian, and she traveled in 2020 to Wuhan to report on the real situation at the start of the COVID pandemic. And for that, she was thrown into prison for 4 years. She was just recently, last month, she was released, but still very much cut off from the rest of the world. And so that is also a part of this new development of Christianity entering the public sphere. But what I thought I would do is to go to one case, an early case in this in the emergence of public Christianity, and the case is that of He Guanghu. He played a very unique and prominent role in bringing Christianity and Christian theology into the cultural mainstream, starting in the late 1980s and continuing since then down to our time. So for that reason, I like to focus this talk on He Guanghu. Now, so I will be talking about, broadly speaking, 4 different topics. One is the He Guanghu, who is He Guanghu, and what are some of his most important writings. And 2, some of the predominant or prominent themes in He Guanghu's theological writing. 3, I like to talk about a word on his background, his personal life, and how that might have contributed to his theology. And lastly, a broader context of this engagement, this introduction of Christianity into the public sphere as part of a broader phenomenon of what might be called a cultural fever that started in the 1980s. So these are the 4 things that I like to talk about. So first of all, I have here a list on the screen of some of the things that we can say about He Guanghu. He is a founder, not the only one, and an architect of the so-called Sino-Christian theology called 汉语神学. They had a long debate process trying to figure out what to call this theology. And they settled on the term, that the Chinese term is important. It's called 汉语神学. So strictly speaking, literally translated as Chinese language theology. So while they attempted using this term Sino-Christian theology, it may not communicate what the Chinese version was intended to do, which is it's not about China, it's about Chinese language. They want to draw a distinction between the two. And if I have time, I'll come back to this. He was a research fellow at the Institute of World Religions at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. It was a very top academic, government-supported academic institution studying social sciences. And he was a research fellow there. The moment he got his doctoral degree in 1989. And he was editor-in-chief of a book series called Religions and the World the book series. And it started publishing in 1988. In other words, he became editor-in-chief of this book series before he got his PhD, while he was still working on his doctoral degree. And that book series featured important Western writers and theologians, including Christopher Dawson, Paul Tillich, T.S. Eliot, Bonhoeffer, and John Macquarie. He Guanghu had a special connection to the works of John Macquarie. He was editor of the very first government state publication, or the state authorized publication called 基督教文化评论, Christian Culture Review, that came on in the early 1990s. He was co-editor. With Liu Xiaofeng, and when Liu Xiaofeng went to Basel for his doctoral degree, then He Guanghu took over as the only editor of that series. And that was really later known as the Chinese Journal of Theology. It's now based in Hong Kong at Daofengshan. And so he was there at the CASP, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, until 2001. And then he moved on to become a professor at Renmin University in Beijing. He was one of the first 303 signatories of Charter 08. Many of you are familiar with this, this remarkable, very bold, really a historic document in 2008 calling for constitutional reforms and promoting universal values of human rights and democracy. And of course, Liu Xiaobo, that was one of the main reasons that Liu Xiaobo was thrown into jail, into prison, and eventually died there in 2017 for being a, Liu Xiaobo was not the only one who authored this Charter 08, but he played a major role in this. But He Guanghu was one of the original 303 signatories. So that was a very bold move on his part. And by the way, he also participated in the Tiananmen democracy movement, but he was his was a very moderate voice even during the Tiananmen democracy movement. Now, he has been a leading academic theological voice in post-Mao China, in contrast to the three self-leaders. This government's sanctioned three self-churches, and this leader and the face of Chinese Christianity in the post-Mao era was Ding Guangxun, Bishop Ding. But in He Guanghu's view, that kind of government supported and authorized that kind of a theological writing and voice was kind of what he called political theology up in the air, 悬空的政治神学. He Guanghu was a leading Christian public intellectual in the post-Tiananmen China, and this is what sets him apart from many others. He is a prominent establishment scholar because he was with the top government research institution, the Chinese Academies of Social Sciences. So he was a prominent establishment scholar with an independent voice. What can be called a shaper of public opinion. Here, that's a term called 意见领袖. I am borrowing here the term used by Liu Xiaobo. Liu Xiaobo calls for these 意见领袖, that intellectuals should become the shaper of public opinion and should not be co-opted by the state. And He Guanghu was exactly this type of voice. And I do apologize for my cough. I'm just getting something. Let me see if I know how to work this. Okay. So a word on some of his most important or best known works. And by the way, He Guanghu, his writings mostly came out in the form of essays. Various kinds of essays, sometimes book reviews, sometimes foreword to a translation, and essays published in various journals. But from time to time, he collected them into these edited volumes. So the works that I'm going to share with you here on the screen are these collections. As you see, the first one that on the screen here, 多元化的上帝观, is basically a survey of Western philosophy of religion in the 20th century. And that is an unusual kind of work because most of his works has to do with China. So the next two works on the screen here, The Moon in the Stream, 月映万川, Religion, Society, and Life, published in 2005, and then again in 2007, and then Dust and Dirt, 30 Years of Accomplishments and Fame, reference to a famous quote by Yue Fei, 2010. Again, these are collections of his previously published essays. Excuse me. Oh, sorry. I still haven't quite figured out how to make this work. Okay.
Yeah.
There we go. And the most recent two collections of his writings, one is called Holding a Candle in the Tunnel, and Born in Sorrow, Grown in Grief, Selected Essays in Sino-Christian Theology. The last one is from 2021. You want to note the title here because it now communicates a different kind of mood. Particularly from the 30功名成语图, 30 years of fame and accomplishments and fame. Now, in more recent years, a candle in a tunnel and sorrow and grief. All right, so second, I'd like to talk about some of the prominent themes in He Guanghu's theological writings. And these I find to be very consistent themes, since the 1990s down to our time. Even though in the last few years, he's taken on some new topics like AI or the COVID, personal liberty versus kind of social responsibility, those kind of things. But other than that, most of these years, he has written about some of issues of top concern to him. And these are public issues. And so here I am to highlight some of the prominent themes. This is not an exhaustive list. No. Number one, Christianity promises modernity. So here's the first quote I'd like to share. As a Chinese language scholar, my starting point was indeed China. And this is, I think he's during an interview, he reflected back on his early writings. Concerned with the issue of Chinese modernity, I believe that it was the foremost task of Chinese theology to reflect on the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, which shaped global modernity. The first thing that can be said about Chinese modernity is that it has yet to be fully realized. The second is that the nationalistic complex has predominated. And he's very worried about that ultranationalism, which leads to the third point, and that is the stagnation of democratization. So modernity is an issue, of course, they have obsessed, the Chinese have been obsessed with since the 1980s. So he addresses that. He addresses modernity. He's basically offering Christianity as the real incubator, if you will, of modernity. And This another theme is Christian ethics, how it offers a real solution for the moral crisis in contemporary China. So I do some of the summary here. The reason that all revolutionary slogans, he commented on these revolutionary slogans promoting CCP's, Chinese Communist Party's morality, since the 1950s, from communist morality and revolutionary morality to the more recent 8 honors and 8 shames, 8荣8耻 under Hu Jintao. But they've all failed, he said. And that is because there's a fundamental problem, and that is all these prescriptions for moral ailments of China are secular. The Christian belief that moral laws were instituted by God and therefore cannot be breached has, of course, become an important resource for healing the moral ailments in China. So again, it's a very practical issue. Moral crisis in contemporary China, this enemy, and how do we offer a sort of moral compass? And Christianity offers the best solution to that. And another theme is that Christianity can cultivate a healthier and more peaceful Chinese society. Again, it's an issue of public concern. So he addresses this something that's much talked about in Chinese media, the fragmentation of the family and the desertification of the society. And then he wrote church fellowship and cell group activities and friendly, close human relationships formed this way, form in the church, have been able to counter such atomization of individuals and the sense of being adrift, morally adrift. They can bring many people a degree of psychological relief. And then he wrote an article commenting on these 2 deadly incidents. Both were arsons, fire deliberately set on buses and killing many people. One was in a bus in Xiamen in 2013, and then another incident, same kind of incident, of a bus in Guiyang that was set on fire and killing a number of people. And here's what he offered, not just to the Christian community, but to the Chinese public, urging them to consider if a migrant worker who is aggrieved over unpaid wages, or a young man who is mentally unstable from frustrated romantic passions, goes into a church and is comforted by a pastor, and these two refer to these 2 incidents behind arsons on the bus. If he goes into a church and is comforted by a pastor, we will have less chance of someone placing a bomb on the bus. It wasn't actually a bomb; it was someone setting the bus on fire, but it almost like it was like a bomb. So now going beyond that moral issues and social problems to a deeper problem of political system, the autocracy. He Guanghu addresses what he calls the cultural cancerization of Chinese tradition. What he meant by that is the development of the autocratic tradition. The bane of autocracy is the concept of the Son of Heaven. But our reason and realities tell us that the rulers have no direct, let alone blood, relations to heaven or God. Why then have the Chinese people chosen a name and a concept that for thousands of years have caused them harm and bestowed it on their political leaders? The Shang ruler, yes, going back to the 2nd millennium BCE, they turned Shangdi into his own ancestor and confused the worship of heaven with ancestor worship. That's He Guanghu's rendering of that. Such a concept treated the imperfect as perfect, the non-ultimate as the ultimate, and the profane as the sacred. The result was the absolutization of the relative and misguided dedication and zealotry and the deformity of Chinese culture as well as other ailments. That became the ideological root of countless tragedies and calamities in Chinese history. You will find He Guanghu often speaks in the using the vocabulary of philosopher, the philosophical kind of parlance. So, offering a sort of spiritual diagnosis of the political system of autocracy. And the implication is obvious. All right. And so this is what he offers. Christianity can help remake Chinese culture and civilization. Christianity can cure that cancer in the Chinese culture and the political system. The social influences of Sino-Christian theology will extend outward from the theological circle to Chinese Christianity and then to Chinese culture or Chinese civilization. In other words, as a movement, Sino-Christian theology will play a vital spiritual role in the new birth of Chinese culture or civilization. I think this particularly, and this is a quote, I think this particularly speaks to his mood in the late 1980s and 1990s. But in a way, he held on to that even down to last few years. I doubt that he's still feeling the same way today. But until very recently, he still held on to that kind of vision of Christianity helping to remake Chinese civilization. And one topic on which He Guanghu wrote a lot about, he is quite passionate about. And I must say, it's very courageous for him to write about because it's very unpopular in China, which is to cry out against ultranationalism. And he cites many examples. He cites the example of this very selective nationalist rage that the Chinese public has directed against, for instance, the US bombing of Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1919, which the US maintained was an accident, but the Chinese almost, at least those ultranationalists, almost universally said it was calculated, it was deliberate bombing, not accidental bombing. And therefore, this nationalist public rage against the US. But also, He Guanghu noted this that rage was not directed against Russia. After the Russian warship sank a Chinese vessel in 2009, killing 7. That's very recent, isn't it? And he also points to the selective solidarity the Chinese feel with fellow Chinese. So true nationalism or nation or patriotism would identify with the Chinese nation, but then they have no solidarity with those Chinese in Taiwan, Chinese-speaking people in Taiwan, or the Chinese immigrants in Indonesia during the anti-Chinese riot of 1998. He said the only way to make sense of this selective kind of public rage or public solidarity is to see it as a kind of distorted kind of nationalism, what he calls statism. Now, statism is not, I mean, he used that term, English term, but it does not quite convey what he tried to say in Chinese, 国权主义, the ideology of state rights, worship of the state. So that's what he meant. And he traced that to a very ancient period in Chinese history. It's in the era before even the Qing dynasty, the first emperor of China, a time before the birth of nationalism, thousands of years before, at least almost 2,000 years before the birth of nationalism. A crude statism had already emerged, he argues. It is what Karl Marx calls general slavery or state slavery, and the Chinese emperors even chose the dragon, a ferocious animal in the Chinese legend, as the symbol of their statism. And one interesting thing, a sort of ironic thing to note is that He Guanghu, having done his studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, where the Marxist theories and Marxist works reign supreme, he often used, whenever appropriate, whenever he sees a chance, use some Marxist language to back up his point in support of Christianity or in his larger point. And that I think may have been very effective. Marx called ancient China a general slavery. He's arguing that this kind of slavery continued down to our time, and you cannot fault him for using Marx. And here's another quote in which he urged Christians and the Chinese to reject ultra-nationalism. There were a series of chauvinistic editorials in state media in 2013, and you will know that this is the year when Xi Jinping came to power. So state media were echoing Xi Jinping's call for the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation and advocated that China should dominate Asian affairs. So this is what He Guanghu wrote to try to caution his fellow countrymen. The state can never be the end for God, nor can it be the end for humanity. The end must be reconciliation with God and the salvation of souls, he wrote. The end must be the kingdom of God. Is justice our priority, or a wealthy nation and a strong army? Wealthy nation and a strong army is a slogan that the Chinese elite had chanted since the late 19th century. From the Christian point of view, it is the former. Is world peace our priority, or the rejuvenation of a particular nation? From the Christian perspective, it is again the former. In our time, it is globalism, not nationalism, that better aligns with the interest of each and every nation. And then the next quote I have here is, of all the major world religions, Christianity is least colored by the nation state. To put it another way, it is least connected to nationalism and most opposed to, I'm missing a word here, most opposed to ultranationalism. You may debate that, but that's what He Guanghu asserts. Christianity is the best, that is a healthy force against ultranationalism. Again, another quote. He cares deeply about this, and this is more a kind of theological treatment. As an ideology, nationalism can easily be turned into idolatry, the cult of personality, and the cult of personality. As the most calamitous century in human history, the 20th century offers countless examples of this tendency. It proves that such an idolatry, which claimed the lives of tens of millions of people and destroyed tens of millions of families, may be the greatest enemy of humanity. Sorry. Neither the nation nor the state has any ultimate significance for an individual. He goes back to Paul Tillich. That's one of the earliest works he translated, you'll see. As a limited, relative, transient, and conditional earthly phenomenon, a nation or a state can at best become, under the most unusual circumstances, what Paul Tillich calls a preliminary concern. It is humanity's greatest cognitive mistake and confusion of faith to mistake the preliminary for the ultimate and to view the former as a limitless, absolute, eternal, and unconditional reality, and to sacralize it, worship it, and dedicate ourselves to it. So, another topic, another theme that he wrote about has to do with the definition, understanding, and self-positioning of Sino-Christian theology. After all, he and Liu Xiaofeng, another intellectual, in the early 1990s, they were the architect of this new kind of theology, and they were very careful about this. And you can see here, he sort of deliberately went against some of the trend, such as particularly indigenized theology or contextualized theology. He calls for a vernacular theology. I'm very skeptical about the rationality of the term indigenization. It gives me the impression that we need to paint Christian theology in a local or indigenous color, or adopt Christianity a local or indigenous appearance. As humans, we're forced to serve limited purposes in a limited way, but that means precisely that humans have to admit their own limitations. They should not treat the limited as the unlimited and the relative as the absolute. It's not only absurd and close-minded to make what is indigenous the ultimate goal and the ultimate evaluative standard. It would lead to sin and disasters. He and Liu Xiaofeng had long conversations in the early 1990s about what to call this new theology that they try to come up with, to introduce to the Chinese cultural mainstream. And they were both very careful at resisting any kind of cultural chauvinism. The reason they did not want to settle on the Chinese theology, they did not want to give the impression that this is glorifying the Chinese nation or the Chinese people. They want to be very careful that they want to distance themselves from Chinese nationalism. And they thought the best way is to use the word Hanyu, Chinese language theology. It's spoken by people both in mainland China, in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, Macau, and then overseas, in Southeast Asia, North America. So in that way, it was an attempt to transcend this geographic or ethnic kind of understanding of this new theology that they were trying to generate. And his fellow intellectual, Christian intellectual at the time, Liu Xiaofeng has changed since then. Liu Xiaofeng wrote that this Sino-Christian theology is not Sinicide theology, but a theology that was born in the existential circumstances of Chinese language. In its essence, theology has no East-West distinctions. So they both try to affirm the particularities of Chinese language theology and the fact that we cannot be confined by our own experience. It's a theology that draws on the lived experience, historical experience, and the cultural resources of Chinese tradition. And it primarily serves the Chinese-speaking world, but it does not pretend to be a theology that's higher than other theology. And then here's another point that he frequently makes, and that is theology must be earthbound. And I'm running out of time, so I should cut some of these. He's saying that theological exploration should be an odyssey of ascending to heaven and descending to earth. It plays with words here. And to speak of ascending is to affirm that we start upwards from down below. So it must be earthbound. And then he makes the theological defense of this kind of priority that he sets for himself. We have such a great love for humanity, and we merely shift the focus of theology and turn it into a theology of culture, of politics, and of morality that addresses practical issues in China. So the theology takes a humbler posture and investigates problems that are filled with the cooking smoke and fire in the human realm, which should not be accursed by God, who loves the world and loves justice, or be cut off from Christ, who came into the world to redeem humanity. When he wrote this, he was quite well aware of the fact that for the most part, the Chinese Christian theological tradition, particularly that of in popular Christianity, outside of the elite circle, they were very much concerned with the opposite of what this earthbound theology was. They were concerned with things like premillennial dispensationalism, the end-time work of God. And this, in contrast, is earthbound. So here are some of the prominent features that we could say. Christian humanism, and even though he was against ultranationalism, I think you can sense a deep patriotism, a care for the Chinese people and the nation so that it can enter into modernity. And you also find his theological and cultural views, his voice to be a moderate one. If we have more time, we can talk about that. And then a globalist or a pro-Western spirit. Briefly, his background, I think the background play a large role in shaping his theological preoccupation and concerns and temperament. His father had worked for the nationalist government before the communist takeover in 1949. He was a petty, official in that nationalist uh, state, and for that he was arrested in the early 1950s and then never heard of again, presumably shot.
Well,
And his mother also was imprisoned, even though she was just a party member of the nationalist. And so it was a very difficult childhood, as you can imagine, lots of poverty. And then during the Cultural Revolution, the whole family suffered dislocations. They moved from place to place. He was sent down to the countryside, and he brought back to Guiyang. He was from Guizhou province, born in Guiyang, very hinterland, rural, mountainous part of China. And even from there, he was sent down to the countryside as the educated youth. And he worked as a elementary school teacher and middle school teacher during many of those years. But it was kind of a life of exile. But he maintained this very disciplined self-study during those times. Whatever books he could find, he would read. And it was during those years that he took up the study of English. His English abilities play a very large role in his later career. So he self-studied. He taught himself English, and the only textbook he could find was the selected works of Chairman Mao, Mao Zedong Xuanji, and the quotations of Chairman Mao. Those were already translated into English by 1966. So he had those as his only available English textbooks. And then he was very lucky to become, in 1977, some of you know that Deng Xiaoping, um, it was the time when Deng Xiaoping was about to come back to power, and the college entrance examination was brought back. 1977 was the first year that the nationwide college entrance examination was held. So he sat for the examination. He was admitted to Guiyang Teachers College in early 1978. So he was the first class of college students after the Cultural Revolution. And that class is referred to by the year of their admission entrance. So he's the class of 1977. And quickly afterwards, while he was still an undergraduate, he saw an opportunity to sit for examination for the graduate program at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. So he sat for that exam. He chose the major of Christianity, both because of some of the early exposures he had to Christianity, and because he said that it's one of the easier topics, easier subjects to study, field to study. You only need to be tested in English, in Marxist views on religion, in world history, and some knowledge in Christianity. And his only source of knowledge on Christianity, he said, was an entry in the Encyclopedia Britannica that he found in the library of the college, Guiyang Teachers College. And he just read the entire entry on Christianity, and with that, he sat for the examination and was admitted to the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And later on, he went back in the late 1980s for his doctoral studies, also at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. So his worldview and his sensibilities were really shaped by his scarred memories of China, of Mao's revolution, lots of violence, poverty, and hysteria, so insanity that he saw. And I will also add that his early academic work was really part of this cultural fever of the 1980s. I'm running out of my time here. And just one case, one example of how he was scarred by the revolution. He was very skeptical of liberation theology. There was this Taiwanese-born theologian who taught at the Pacific School of Religion in California, and who advocated, as the title would suggest, Jesus, the crucified people. And he He Guanghu launched into a very spirited uh, uh, attack on that kind of theology, that it glorifies, it deifies people. He said, I know people, I have seen how they act during the Cultural Revolution. It was the and all this collective madness. It was the people who tortured people in the name of the deified people. And so no more of that. So we have to restore Christianity to its reverence for the transcendent. Um, and lastly, I want to point out that He Guanghu's writing was part of this so-called culture fever that began in the late 1980s. It was a time after, in the mid 1980s and continuing into the late 1980s and even into early 1990s. And that is after Mao's death. There was a period of this intellectual, new generation of intellectuals which had a first taste of intellectual freedom, relative freedom, and they wanted to reflect on the deep causes of these political calamities that China has just gone through. And they became interested in culture, the issue of culture. So the word culture here primarily meant Western culture.
Mm.
There were critical reflections on Chinese culture, but a fascination with Western culture. And that here's He Guanghu's quote. He suspected that there was a deeper secular ideology lies at the roots of all the political maladies that China has gone through. So his earliest works were translations. One of his earliest works were translations. As you can see, many of these some of these came from the book series that he edited. Bonhoeffer, Peter Berger, John Hick, Macquarie, and even presidential debate between Bush, Clinton, and Perot. He translated that. You can see it's a fascination with Western culture and Western tradition and Western society. And he was not alone. A famous work that came out at the time was Culture Fever. This period of cultural fever was Liu Xiaofeng, who had collaborated with him with the launch of this Chinese language theology or Sino-Christian theology. The title of the book, it was a sensational book coming out in 1988 called 拯救与逍遥. Its English translation is delivering and dallying. That Chinese tradition is one of dallying, And I won't go into all this, but you can see there was a very serious critique of Chinese tradition that it lacked the transcendent consciousness. That he referred to the famous Chinese poet from the late 4th and early 3rd century BCE, Qu Yuan, who killed himself. It was a despair resulting from the crisis of faith. And he argues that Chinese intellectuals have always gone through this crisis of faith, that because the Chinese spirit has no tragic sense, it has not found salvation in the chanting of lamentations. So in other words, the cure for all these maladies is to introduce the Christian concept of redemption. And there was another sensational thing. It's a TV series also coming out in 1988. It's a very didactic 6-part TV series as another key moment in this cultural fever. And it took up on the recent tragic failures of Yellow River rafting expedition because they want to beat the Americans. They want to be the first Chinese to explore Yellow River. And of course, they all died in this rafting expedition. And the series proclaimed that there are pains in the soul of nation, and all these pains because civilization has decayed. and it needs to be replenished with a new civilization factor. And the sun of the Asia has set, and you can see all this, and that the and Yellow River became a symbol of Chinese this autocratic tradition that rages its way for thousands of li or thousands of years, but now the moment has come for it to flow into the azure sea, the ocean. We can no longer decline the invitation. You can see how all this opened the Chinese cultural sphere to Christian influences, Christian ideas. Here's an observation by Wakeman at the time of this of the TV series was aired. For all its glorification of the industrialized Western world beyond the azure ocean, Hershan remains at its heart deeply nationalistic. So here's the irony. These people are almost universally very nationalistic, but they were bold enough to critique the Chinese tradition as something that held China back. And He Guanghu's work emerged out of this broader context. So finally, just a comment on how his work can be fit into this broader context of a post-Mao Christian vision for saving China. And I cite here the examples, a few quotes from Yuan Zhiming, from Yang Xiaokai, from Xie Xuanjun. Yuan Zhiming and these are all exiled intellectuals, Chinese intellectuals. Yuan Zhiming and Xie Xuanjun, they were all participants in the Tiananmen democracy movement, and they had to flee China because they were on the wanted list or they've been imprisoned. And then they converted to Christianity after leaving China. And I won't have time to read all this, but you can see how they invariably saw Christianity as the real way to save China. Yang Xiaokai, the second one, was a very well-respected Chinese economist. He got his degree from Princeton. Shortly before he died of cancer in Australia, he was living in Australia. He wrote a series of piece on Christianity and constitutionalism, in which he cites Hayek and all these liberal Chinese intellectuals in the post-Mao era. They adore Hayek. He said Protestantism is the only thing in the world that provides what Hayek has called powerful support in the long development of an extended order. That was the original quote, but he adds social order and justice, connecting Christianity with the best human civilization, and with the salvation of China. And I would, and even Liu Xiaobo, you see here, who was not a Christian, who was not a converted Christian, but he had profound sympathies for Christianity. And here's a quote from a private letter he wrote to Liao Yiwu, a fellow writer who's now an exile, living in exile in Germany, referring to this great spirit that could turn around a nation. He referred to Gandhi, Havel. So even more was that humble boy born in a manger 2,000 years ago. You can see a generation of Chinese intellectuals being open, really open to Christianity. And He Guanghu, his work fit into that. And Ian Buruma, many of you may be familiar with him, made some comments after he interviewed Yuan Zhiming and Xie Xuanjun, these Tiananmen exiles who had converted to Christianity. He detected in them their conversion to Christianity, a search for a real solution to China's political problems, and it's the cosmic order. You have to introduce the Chinese to the ultimate, the cosmic order, to give China, to breathe new life into Chinese political system. And Buruma pointed out, like Marxism before, Christianity can be a vehicle for Chinese nationalism. They were very nationalistic, even in their most ferocious attack on the Chinese autocratic tradition. And the last quote I want to share with you is by another very observant Western scholar, John Dewey, from Colombia. He toured China in the early 1920s, and he encountered everywhere. He encountered the Chinese intellectuals, and he wrote, "Wherever a few are gathered together in China, the favorite indoor sport is saving China." And one could argue that that favorite indoor sport has continued down to our time. Finally, returning to He Guanghu, I want to call attention. I'm not going to attempt an evaluation of He Guanghu, but I want to call your attention to his sensibilities as a Confucian scholar. The title of his last two works, Holding a Candle in the Tunnel, is Christian symbolism, but also Confucian, particularly the last one, Born in Sorrow, Grown in Grief. It's a reference to Mengzi, but also it's a reference to the Song Dynasty a scholar who called for scholars to bear the sorrow of a nation. He Guanghu in an interview, very recent interview, I think 2019, he observed history appears to have returned to its starting point. He took note of the many of the setbacks that has happened under Xi Jinping, but he ended with this note. On this note, he quotes Dong Zhongshu from the Han Dynasty, early Han Dynasty. The humane person sets right his own morals, but does not seek his own benefits. He expounds the way, but does not calculate its gains. In other words, he is willing to embrace what William de Barry has called noble failure, if necessary. And that is a profoundly Confucian spirit. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you, T.
So shall I stop sharing my screen?
Stop share, yeah. And this up here. For those of you who've joined online, if you want to ask a question or make a comment, all I have to do is at the bottom screen, there's a reactions button, push on that, and then it says raise hand. Thank you, just a couple questions. I'm very curious about his formation as a student at China Academy of Social Sciences and also his doctoral dissertation. Who were his supervisors?
Interesting. His master's supervisor for the master's degree, that was, bear in mind that this was the very beginning of the first class of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Or maybe the second class, yeah. And his supervisor hardly had time. In both cases, his supervisor hardly had time to spend with him. Okay. They were not just academic; they were very high officials. His master's supervisor was Zhao Fushan, who eventually became the highest-ranking Chinese official to defect to the West after Tiananmen massacre. Zhao Fushan was the deputy director of the Institute of World Religion at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. He was a former Anglican priest. He was also a secret underground Communist Party member. That's why he became he had the trust of the party to be the leader of at this institute. His doctoral advisor was Ren Jiyu, who was really a scholar of Chinese Buddhism. So Ren Jiyu hardly spent any time with him. Yeah. And, but that was his, but the reality is his doctoral studies brought him to the very center of Chinese academic life in the late 1980s.
Is Zhao Fushan Shanghai Ren?
Yes.
Is he from Shanghai? Yeah. Which would fit with the Anglican and also.
And they were all St. John's University graduates.
Yeah, which probably Ding Guangchun as well. Or at least that's the rumor. So anyway, the rumor was the person who become head of the Chinese church was also a secret party member. That's the rumor. Okay. But there was a whole
confirmed. Yeah.
Was it confirmed finally?
Zhao Fushan was a confirmed secret CCP member, not Ding Guangxing.
Not Ding Guangxi, right, it's still up in the air for Ding. But the whole Shanghai diocese was very, very important. And Ding would be the last ordained bishop of the Anglican Church, and everybody thought he'd ordain somebody, he never did, but, okay, so that's good, Zhao Fusan. What's his relationship with Zhuo Xingping and the current China Academy of Social Sciences? Was he teaching there or just at Beijing University? He Guanghu.
Zhuo Xingping was one class before He Guanghu.
Okay,
Graduate class, one class before him. He was the second. He Guanghu was the second.
okay. So Xingping must have been quite a bit younger because He Guanghu's a bit older.
I don't know. I mean, He Guanghu was right there at as the very first, scholar at this cultural center who studied Christianity.
Yeah, well, very, very interesting. Is his first post at Beijing University or He Guanghu? Or where is he posted upon completion of the doctorate?
After he finished his master's program at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, he went to teach at the police academy in Jiangsu, something like Marxist, teaching Marxist theories, that kind of thing, or religion.
Okay.
So he was there for about 3 years, and then he went back to the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences for his doctoral program. And after that, he, as you can see, even before he graduated, even before he completed his degree, he was already entrusted with this very prestigious, position, responsibility to edit this new series.
Okay.
Groundbreaking series on China and the world. So, and then his affiliations remain with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences until 2001.
Last question, I'll turn it over. But was Liu Xiaofeng at China Academy of Social Sciences when they meet up?
Liu Xiaofeng got his degree from Beijing University.
At Beidai.
Beidai.
But where do they just meet in Beijing and get connected, or?
Well, they met in Beijing. I think that's where they met, but also later on they collaborated a lot in Hong Kong. Dao Fengshan.
Okay, and Dao Fengshan. Oh wow.
Yes, in Hong Kong.
Yeah, that's really, really. Liu Xiaofeng is famous for what's called cultural Christianity, which was a whole idea that if you took the culture of Christianity, it would be liberating for China, but kind of a cultural Christianity without Jesus. I mean, in a sense, as a system, as a way of being in the world. I may be speaking wrongly there, but he was very famous for that, and an important scholar that way, as alternative ways of living and being. So, yeah. Questions here? Yes.
Yes, about the three self theology that he was, did I understand he wasn't in favor of that theology? How did he address or was it implicit in his theology that the church would become self-sustained? Or how did he address it in his theology if he was not in favor of the three self theology?
Thank you. That's a very, very good question. It goes to the heart of a very important division, a very unusual phenomenon and a division in Chinese Christianity, which is the most serious theological work was done outside the church. The three self theology, you cannot really speak of three self theology in the 1950s. The only thing was a slogan, the severing ties with American imperialists and all that. And but in the 1980s and particularly into the 1990s, Ding Guangxing, he was the face of Chinese Protestantism in the post-Mao era. Ding Guangxing did make some attempt at this public theology, the Chinese theology, that will be compatible with the socialist realities and socialist goals of China. And so he would put forward these very uh, slogans, you know, not meant to be provocative. Slogans such as 办好教会, we must, you know, run the church well. You know, you could hardly call it theology. But Divinity did propose that we must 淡化因信得救. We must downplay the theology of salvation by faith, because Ding Guanxi noted that the Chinese Christians tend to be political apathetic, disengaged in society, and only care about their own salvation, that we must care for society. Of course, he proposed that we do this in a way that's compatible with what the government wants us to do, to care for society. And so again, it's very hard to consider that as any kind of a serious independent theological work, which is why He Guanghu used a very polite term to refer to that government directed kind of theological enterprise. He calls it 悬空的政治神学, you know, dangling in the air, that theology that's up in the air. But he himself wants to a theology that smells of earth, this earth that we live on. And so that's the distinction they draw. And I'm sure he also was very conscious of the distinction between his theology, his theological concern, and the more predominant theology that you find in the Chinese church. So he operates mostly outside of the Chinese church, because in the Chinese church, particularly at the grassroots level, you know, there's a lot of end-time theology, concern with the you know, how this God's working, you know, cosmic plans and all that, and individual salvation, with no attempt to change the society. Who says, you know, we need to be concerned with the cooking smoke and fire of this human realm. And he was almost defensive about that. You can pick up a sense of that. He knew how this would be frowned upon. And he himself also calls his own theology. He said, my work is not really theological work, not really theological writing. It's writing about theology. It's writing on theology, but it's not theological writing. He was conscious of how earthbound it was, how it was oriented toward the problems of our society, of our world, and our political system.
Okay, John, go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Thank you, Dr. Shi. Very comprehensive. Thank you. I just picked up on a quote that you had from He Guanghu towards the end, and I'm taking it a little bit out of context, but you said that history appears to have returned to its starting point. So I wanted to ask you a question in this context. There's been so much written, and you said He Guanghu spoke about the promises of modernity, and 10 years ago there was a lot of writing about the promises, the potential of Christian values changing Chinese society. That conversation seems to have been very muted post-Sinization. I'm wondering if you have any comments about that.
Thank you. This is something that is very much on He Guanghu's mind, and we have to bear in mind that in 1980s and 1990s, you have these book series coming out of our state. Authorized state official media, publishers and journals. These were all state-approved journals, and you could actually publish articles about theology, about Christianity in those journals. So there was a remarkable period of opening, China's opening, and he really took full advantage. He and his fellow so-called cultural Christians took full advantage of that era of opening. And so it's, their works were published not only in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, but also in mainland China. But that era has ended. And that's what he was referring to. He realized that in more recent years, how difficult it is to publish anything in the state media that has anything to do with Christian theology or Christianity without being frowned upon. And he noticed, for instance, at one point a few years ago, he organized a academic conference, and he presented a paper at a conference, but even his own paper could not be published. And so that sphere, that space has shrunk and almost disappeared. And so it's in that sense, both his own frustrations and the frustrations that he observed on the part of other Christian scholars in recent years, that has given him this sense that history has returned to its starting point. We are now back to the pre-1980s era.
So, yes, thank you for that. I guess my second question upon reflection of that then is your own thoughts about that opening up again, that conversation opening up again.
Thank you. Of course, I'm sure Guanghu himself is very much interested in that question. I'm sure he is asking that question as well. Well, in the near future, the chance of China reopening this kind of public space, intellectual space, and allowing Christian intellectuals into the cultural mainstream and put them at the center in conversation with other independent, schools of academic thinking, is almost none. There's almost no chance of that happening again. On the other hand, it is also important to take note of very significant historical change since the 1980s, particularly after Tiananmen massacre, as the Chinese intellectuals increasingly became either co-opted by the state or driven away from academic pursuit, from academia, into money making, into business world, and become professionals. Christians have become disproportionately represented in the public sphere. When the Chinese cracked down on the Tibetans in 2008, Christians spoke out in defense of the Tibetans. And, Sichuan earthquake in 2008, the Christians organized in relief. And you have so many petitioners from all over China going to Beijing to try to petition the government to address their grievances. And these petitioners will often encounter, kind of a police from their own provinces snatching them and hauling them back to the provinces. And so they are, while they're in Beijing, they are sort of refugees. They live like refugees. And then you have Christian churches who open the space for them, supporting them. So it's become a lot more diversified in terms of Christian involvement in public life. And I just make reference to Zhang, this young, incredibly courageous woman. She just turned 40. She saw it as her Christian duty to tell truth about the true state of the pandemic in the early years when Wuhan was in lockdown. And she posted her videos on YouTube so that the world could see what's happening in China. And it's foolhardy. She knew that what awaited her was assured, crackdown, arrest, but she saw it as a Christian duty, and she made it very explicit. So the Christian presence in the public sphere has been a lot more diversified, diffused, if you will. So we're not going to see the same kind of return to the elite circle. But then outside the government-approved elite circle, which is losing its prestige anyway, we are seeing a much more diverse kind of opportunities for Christian participation.
David, go
Yes,
ahead.
thank you for that, Dr. Shi.
Yeah, thank you for your lecture, Lian. There are various forms of Christianity. There's no one single form of Christianity. Number of weeks ago, the lecturer here is giving one of these MBL lectures, says that the Christianity is not the gospel. It's referring to Western Christianity, and the gospel is different from Western Christianity. We can debate with that lecturer about this point, but it is true that no form of Christianity is perfect. There are strengths in various forms of Christianity, and there are weaknesses. And so when Guanghu talks about Christianity, he seems to talk about it in a positive light. And perhaps he's translated so many of the major Western theological books. I just wonder whether he certainly affirmed Christianity in many ways, but does he offer any critique of Western Christianity, for example, the excessive emphasis on individualistic way of relating to God and that kind of critique?
Thank you. He is broadly aware of these issues in his writing on the COVID pandemic control. He does raise the issue of individual interests, individual rights, freedom versus public responsibility, things like that. But I would say his preoccupation since the 1980s, given the context of his time, his preoccupation has been with Western Christianity in its post-Reformation form as a liberating force, as a civilizing force for China. It will bring a kind of a political enlightenment, a kind of social healing of Chinese society, of all its various kinds of ailments. So it's a very positive force. He does acknowledge the obvious. For instance, how the Western missions were embedded in this in imperialist expansion into China. So this is something easy for him to admit, but he does not spend time dwelling on that part. And again, it's very much because his work emerged just in a very different time. He was not under the pressure to denounce Western imperialism, because the time at the cultural preoccupation at the time was opening China, to follow this metaphor of the Yellow Sea, that Yellow River flowing into the Azure Sea. It's time for the Blue Ocean of China to become part of the Blue Ocean, the world civilization, and Christianity to him is the most important part of Western civilization. Much even more important than its Greco-Roman origins, it's the Christianity. So I think that helps explain what he chose to write about, and what he does not get too much into. Yeah, he's very broadly aware of these different issues, but he is for the most part, and he does not want to present himself as one who sort of idolizes the West. he's willing to admit some of the imperfections in the Western society, but he's eager to find common ground between Chinese traditions and Western, the Christian tradition. One thing that I've not talked about is, I've not had a chance to talk about it, is despite his criticisms of the autocratic tradition in China, he also wants to affirm something in the Chinese culture. Its reverence for heaven, for instance, as a kind of piety, natural piety, which is quite compatible with Christian faith, but something that was twisted, that was distorted, that was lost. So that's, I think that's about what I can say about his view. I would imagine many people, particularly in our time in the most recent years, would be very critical of He Guanghu, his globalist and pro-Western views. And that's the kind of criticism that can be applied to many other liberal scholars of his generation.
Okay, thank you.
Just in terms of his own trajectory post 2013, he did show one book published 2014. Does he just finally resign from the university and just go into obscurity, or is he still in China? Where did He Guanghu end up?
He Guanghu retired from Renmin University. I mean, in China, you all have these fixed retirement age. You have to retire. But even after he retired, he was lecturing very broadly in different parts of China, particularly in the south, in Shantou, in Guangdong province. So he actually noted how popular his lectures were, even drawing more students in Shantou, in Guangdong, than in Beijing.
Yeah.
So he's been active.
What
And,
years? When is he in Shantou?
I think it was Shantou Daxue. I may be wrong, but
But what years?
what year? I think he retired, if I remember correctly, around 2016. So a few years after that, he was teaching that. And then he came to the States in I think he probably came to the States at the end of 2019 or 2020. And then he just recently went back to Beijing.
Okay.
And he actually it's just a coincidence. He lived for more than a year here in Chapel Hill.
I didn't know that.
So we met and I have the opportunity to interview him and all that. So it was very nice getting to spend some time with him, and went to concert together and all that. I also want to note here, and that his wife, Gao Shining, is actually a very important scholar to take note of. She's a sociologist, a social scientist, and if you know that most of He Guanghu's early translations of English works were actually done by his wife, by Gao Shining. He Guanghu called himself the reviser. I think they collaborated on translation. So just in her own right, she's a very important scholar of Christianity, but her focus is on contemporary China, contemporary Chinese Christianity.
She was at the 2013 conference as well.
Yes.
She was here. One thing, just a correction. It wasn't Oxford University that really held the conference. It was the Oxford Center for Mission Studies, and we dragged them along. All right, we dragged them to get their name. But when you look at the New York Times article and the Oxford consensus, they all tie it to the more prestigious university down the street. But in all fairness, they were sort of along for the ride. We carried it.
But it was held at Wycliffe College.
No.
In this building.
Right here. Okay.
This building.
Thank you for that correction.
They stayed in the Wycliffe dormitories.
Okay. All right.
but it was here.
Okay.
They
That's
entertain us here as well.
All right, that's
I know,
great.
I organized that conference, but it really was no problem because there were articles right up in the Economist, New York Times. They don't mention OCMS, but all the pictures are of our buildings.
All right.
Guanghu, he was here as well.
Yeah, Guanghu was here.
He came to the conference
And he
here.
does a very important paper at that conference, but yeah, he's a Beijing person, right?
No, Brendan.
No, he's Beijing Ren,对? Where did he grow up?
Guizhou.
In Guizhou, in Guiyang.
Guizhou, all right, I just wanted to.
Bishop Sack has a
Yeah.
hands here.
Yeah, I'm curious as to whether, but thank you very much. This is very educative for me, given my own critique of Christianity. Thank you for adding more fire to my, you're helping me to be more clear about the dangers of Christianity. I'm curious, did he have any interaction, engagement with other forms of Christianity other than Western? I mean, for example, any connections with the resisting movements of imperialism that were in India, Africa, that would have been focusing on the gospel and yet opposed to Western forms of imperialism that were addressed in Christianity. So any connections, engagements, relationships with other than Western embodiments of Christianity?
To my knowledge, his preoccupation has been with Western theology. You look at the list of works that they translated, and at the time, it was the spirit of the time to only focus on Western works, and English and American, German, those works. Liu Xiaofeng went to study in Switzerland, and then later on study works of Moltmann and all that. So that was the preoccupation. That was the trend. And to my knowledge, the extent to which He Guanghu went beyond Western theology was to review those books about Asian theology, because that was closer to his own context, and he was very critical of that.
Yeah.
CSO.
Well, good. Well, thank you, Shi, for absolutely illuminating lecture. Look forward to seeing you in a couple of months. And just really good to have you speak. And you complete the series. And so anybody interested in seeing the other from Yang Gang or Hannah Nation, myself, or Shi can see those on the YouTube channel. But again, just very appreciative